Okay, everybody, let's dive into our lecture on ecological momentary assessment and behavioral coding. First of all, what is ecological momentary assessment? That's quite a name, huh? We sometimes want to survey people out in the real world and study their behaviors. And ecological momentary assessment can take on many different forms. So by definition, we refer to ecological momentary assessment as assessing respondents out in the wild. Okay, well, what's the wild for humans? So that's us just living out in our everyday world. So we actually give people sometimes apps on their smartphone, or maybe we might back in the old days we used to give them beepers and a big old stack of papers to fill out surveys. But we would page them every time they needed to fill out a survey. But one of the benefits of this is that we get responses relative to natural events, and we look at respondents' moods and their intentions and behaviors. So what this allows us to do, rather than studying it in the lab or using a survey that asks, how do you typically respond when somebody's in need, like if you're assessing empathy or something like that, we get slices of events from everyday life. So there's three types. I'm going to talk about two types here. The first type is called experience sampling, and I have an example of it from a colleague of mine by the name of Jordan Qualia, and a study that he did in 2015. He wanted to study if romantic partners, when they would have disagreements or pleasant times with each other, were associated with feelings of rejection in everyday life. And so what he did was he gave romantic couples smartphone apps on their phone, and every time they had an interaction with each other, uh, they would fill out the survey and make sure that they both were filling it out at the same time. So this is an experience sample in that participants are given a set of instructions about when to respond, and they repeat back to the experimenter in the lab, okay, I know how to respond and when to respond. And so what what they would do is anytime they had a social interaction that lasted longer than 5 minutes, they would take out their phones and fill out two quick surveys about their enjoyment and maybe even like frustration with the social interaction, and whether or not they felt rejected or connected to their partner. Okay, so this is experience sampling because they've been given a set of instructions, and then they go and fill out the surveys when they meet the criteria laid out in those instructions. Probe cut sampling, on the other hand, might ask participants to install an app on their phone, like I've mentioned. But instead of giving them instructions about when they're supposed to respond, um, the probe cut sampling actually sends people a message on their phone, like through a push notification or something like that, and asks the respondent to tell people how they're feeling right there in that moment. So this is really good for catching things like mind wandering. So speaking of mind wandering, I want to show you an example of probe cut sampling here. Um, okay. Eventually one day I'm going to figure out how to use all this technology, but hopefully by the time I figure it out, we'll be back in person together as friends again. Okay, so this guy's name is Matthew Killingsworth. It's kind of like a Bond villain's name. Anyway, he's telling us about a study that he did where he wanted to see if being in the moment makes you happier. So let's go ahead and see what Matthew has to say. We're not going to watch all 10 minutes. Oh, we get to see an ad. Fun stuff.
So People want a lot of things out of life, but I think more than anything else, they want happiness. Aristotle called happiness the chief good, the end towards which all other things aim. According to this view, the reason we want a big house, or a nice car, or a good job, isn't that these things are intrinsically valuable.
That's not
it's that we expect them to bring us happiness. Now, in the last 50 years, we Americans have gotten a lot of the things that we want. We're richer, we live longer, we have access to technology that would have seemed like science fiction just a few years ago. The paradox of happiness is that even though the objective conditions of our lives have improved dramatically, we haven't actually gotten any happier. Maybe because these conventional notions of progress haven't delivered big benefits in terms of happiness, there's been an increased interest in recent years in happiness itself. People have been debating the causes of happiness for a really long time, in fact, for thousands of years, but it seems like many of those debates remain unresolved. As with many other domains in life, I think the scientific method has the potential to answer this question. In fact, in the last few years, there's been an explosion in research on happiness. For example, we've learned a lot about its demographics, how things like income and education, gender and marriage relate to it. But one of the puzzles this has revealed is that factors like these don't seem to have a particularly strong effect. Yes, it's better to make more money rather than less, or to graduate from college instead of dropping out, but the differences in happiness tend to be small. Which leaves the question, what are the big causes of happiness? I think that's a question we haven't really answered yet, but I think something that has the potential to be an answer is that maybe happiness has an awful lot to do with the contents of our moment-to-moment experiences. It certainly seems as we're going about our lives that what we're doing, who we're with, what we're thinking about have a big influence on our happiness, and yet these are the very factors that have been very difficult, in fact, almost impossible for scientists to study. A few years ago, I came up with a way to study people's happiness moment to moment as they're going about their daily lives on a massive scale all over the world, something we'd never been able to do before. Called trackyourhappiness.org, it uses the iPhone to monitor people's happiness in real time. How does this work? Basically, I send people signals at random points throughout the day, and then I ask them a bunch of questions about their moment-to-moment experience at the instant just before the signal. The idea is that if we can watch how people's happiness goes up and down over the course of the day, minute to minute in some cases, and try to understand how what people are doing, who they're with, what they're thinking about, and all the other factors that describe our day, how those might relate to those changes in happiness, we might be able to discover some of the things that really have a big influence on happiness. We've been fortunate with this project to collect quite a lot of data, a lot more data of this kind than I think has ever been collected before. Over 650,000 real-time reports from over 15,000 people. And it's not just a lot of people, it's a really diverse group. People from a wide range of ages, from 18 to late 80s, a wide range of incomes, education levels, people who are married, divorced, widowed, etc. They collectively represent every one of 86 occupational categories and hail from over 80 countries. What I'd like to do with the rest of my time with you today is talk a little bit about one of the areas that we've been investigating, and that's mind wandering. As human beings, we have this unique ability to have our minds stray away from the present. This guy is sitting here working on his computer, and yet he could be thinking about the vacation he had last month, wondering what he's going to have for dinner. Maybe he's worried that he's going bald. This ability to focus our attention on something other than the present is really amazing. It allows us to learn and plan and reason in ways that no other species of animal can. And yet, it's not clear what the relationship is between our use of this ability and our happiness. You've probably heard people suggest that you should stay focused on the present. Be here now. You've probably heard 100 times.
Okay, so I wanted to just give you a snapshot of how that worked. Notice what he was doing, and I'll tell you the primary finding from the study is that people are typically happier when they're spending their mental time abiding in the present moment rather than thinking about the future or the past. But as you noticed, what Matt was showing you there is that he was using a probe caught sampling method where he would send out notifications to fill out a quick survey about where your mind is right now and how happy you are, and respondents would just fill it out as soon as they got it. 15,000 people participated in this study, and really neat work about where people's minds are part of the time. So we've got these two methods, experience sampling, where participants simply choose when they submit their responses, and probe caught sampling, where experimenters send notifications to participants to respond to surveys. And there's another method here as well, one that I use in my research all the time, called end of day diaries. Not end of days diaries, not like writing about like the apocalypse or anything. It's a diary that you do at the end of the day. And not the kind where you sit down and you go, "Dear journal, I'm so happy to be able to write in you and tell you about the fun things that I accomplished today." No, no, not that kind of diary. It's a survey that you fill out. I want to give you an example of this. One thing that you're probably picking up on is that these surveys are really short. You don't want to burden people with a lot of questions. You want to be able to capture their lived experience from moment to moment. So here's an example from my dissertation. I'm going to stop sharing again. And this will be the last time for this lecture series that we bounce back and forth like this. Okay. All right. Try again. Here we go. Okay, so here, this is a survey that participants did at home for my dissertation. I wanted to see whether or not an intervention that I used would cause them to be more helpful toward racial outgroup members. So here's how I assess that. They would come in, they'd put in their ID, and they click either true or false if they engaged in a social interaction with an acquaintance or a stranger today. So if they hit true, they had a whole bunch of items that they could select. Maybe they did something really um, benign, like introducing themselves to another person, or maybe they helped somebody out by delaying an elevator, like, "Oh, let me hold that door for you." Maybe they did something mean, like making an aggressive gesture towards someone. I think we can all imagine what that looks like. I remember I had a woman in the study who asked me, and I would sit down and I would train the participants on how to answer these questions. And she said, when I parked my car, we lived in the city where I did my dissertation in Richmond, Virginia. She said, I tried to parallel park and back in, and somebody pulled up too close behind me and they honked at me, and I went like this, and she kind of like bucked at them, and she goes, "Is that an aggressive gesture?" And I said, "Yeah, it's an aggressive gesture." Um, I wouldn't have found it very aggressive because she was very small, but maybe somebody else might have. So let's say we delayed an elevator here, and then we go to the next page. Oops, this is not supposed to look like that. But here we ask you, how many times have you delayed an elevator for someone today? Let's just say it's one time. Click next page. And then here on this survey, it just asked where the interaction took place, from work or church or at a restaurant. This was back in the days where you could go out into public. Long gone are those days. When did it occur? Morning, afternoon? Was it a stranger or an acquaintance? What was the race of the person? So we had them assess this kind of thing here. What was the sex of the person, male or female? Okay, and then there was a final little survey that asked them about their emotions. So I wanted to see if these were interlinked to each other. But they filled this survey out every evening for 7 consecutive days, so we could get at the cyclic pattern in their pro-social behaviors toward racial outgroup members. And here's what we found. So pleasant interactions that were not necessarily helpful, but like introducing yourself to a stranger. These happened about 1 time per day. But check this out. Look, racial in-group members were greeted more pleasantly than racial out-group members. Pretty neat finding here. This is pre-training. There wasn't much of a difference between helping racial in-group members and out-group members. But very interesting that there was a racial in-group bias for pleasant interactions. So this really paired well with the idea that folks are more likely to just have any kind of interaction with in-group members. And unfortunately, I didn't get that many antagonistic behaviors. Folks seem to get a little bit more angry at each other on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, but that's about it. And Fortunately, the training that I gave people didn't help their positive interactions with racial in-group and out-group members. Okay, but we would have never been able to know that. And isn't this cool how it takes like a cyclical pattern? I know that you all might not be interested in that. Okay, so what are some of the benefits of approaching research in this way? Well, one is that you have what's called lower retrospective memory bias when you use EMA. We don't have to look too far back into the past to remember an event. So if I fill out a survey that asks how empathetic I am in my day-to-day life, typically what I will do is I will remember things more positively than they actually are. And that's a problem because we want to study people out there in the real world. That's what this whole lecture is about, is to study how things actually are. If we miss some of that in our surveys because of retrospective memory bias, you don't have as much retrospective memory bias because you back up the response right to when the event happens. It's not how do you behave across time, it's how did you just behave. It also recognizes that time is a variable. So one issue that I just mentioned here is that we tend to have cyclical patterns throughout the week and throughout the month and even throughout the day, in terms of our physiology and our psychology and even our behavior. As you might expect, people are less helpful on the weekends because they're staying at home and enjoying the time. They might be more helpful on the weekdays because they're getting out and about and going to work and interacting with more people. It has some problems though. You can still prime socially desirable responding. Okay, so people could lie about what they did. And sometimes when you tell people that they are going to be measured on a particular thing like pro-social behavior, they'll start to engage in those types of behaviors when they wouldn't have normally done so before. And they do it because they know that you're measuring them. That's a small problem though. And typically that problem can be addressed within the first few days. So if folks respond in that way, it's usually like the first 2 or 3 days. And then after that, they just kind of fill out the survey and they don't change their behaviors. Another issue that we've had come up before is attrition. And you all know what attrition is. So just because we have increased accessibility to surveys, it doesn't necessarily mean that people will actually do it. Think about your everyday life. How often do you miss something that you were supposed to do? I do that all the time. And I suspect that many of you probably do that as well. So what will happen is we have a lot of missing responses. Let's finish off with behavioral coding. I just want to give you a small taste of this, and that's what your paper that you're going to be reviewing this week, and not reviewing, sorry, discussing with your peers in the forum this week is going to be about. It uses behavioral coding to see if we can predict divorce rates in people based on 3 minutes of a marital conflict discussion. So here's a fun example of, I won't show you that video, but you can click it as you want in the PowerPoint that's available to you. But behavioral coding you can think of as a classification system that aims to quantify different behaviors to measure a psychological construct. So there's one that you already might be familiar with called Paul Ekman's facial action coding system. And it measures micro expressions in your facial behaviors, like this fella here. So what Paul Ekman has done is through decades of work, he's found that human emotion is tied inextricably to facial behaviors. He was one of the first ones who knew that Bill Clinton was not telling the truth when he said, I did not have sexual relations with that woman. Of course, we all know that he did, and then he debated about what the definition of the word was, or still is today. That's a very interesting story for probably another time there, but we can all tell the type of face that this person is making here. This looks like a fear response to me. And what Paul Ekman has done is he's taken facial muscles and studied the changes in these facial muscles that accompany different emotions. And what we can do now is through these coding systems, they can actually automate them and put a camera right in somebody's face. And as we show them stimuli, we can see the subtle micro expressions change, and we can study the emotional reactions to that. So some of the benefits of this is that it can be used in controlled experimental settings, just like I described. So one way that I've seen people use it before is in the perfect circle task. This is such a sad task. They ask little kiddos to draw a perfect circle, and every time they draw it, you actually are supposed to, as the experimenter, tell them that that one's not perfect. It's got a little tail there. Can you fix it? And then draw another circle. That one's kind of small, or that one looks like an egg, and it's really supposed to get an emotionally evocative response out of the kid. And the way that we study that is by putting a video camera on the kid and studying their facial expressions. It can also be used in field studies as well, where we study people's expressions as they interact in their everyday life, although that's a little bit harder. Okay. So some common issues to think about are your units of observation. So what constitutes the smallest discriminable segment of behavior? So this needs to be defined whenever you create a behavioral coding measure. Is there a fixed unit of time, 20 seconds, in which a behavior can occur? For the facial action coding system, it's much shorter than that. It's like milliseconds. Or is it a participant's definition of a unit? So what constitutes a unit of observation? Time, a behavior? What is it? We also have issues of classification versus rating. So you can classify behaviors where you say, this was a helping behavior and that was a hurting behavior, and they're qualitatively different. It's a nominal variable, kind of like one that we would use in chi-square. We also have ratings on Likert scales where somebody is watching you behave and you say, that was very much a lie, or that was very much a truth, right? So if you're studying lying, that can happen on a continuum. Okay, and then what about the number of coding dimensions? So maybe you might have several dimensions where you either categorize or rate people. So here we're talking about lies here, and you can see there's several different types of variables and categories that can be in this example. I'm just going to skip through this though and go to the end. So as you're thinking about the behavioral coding system and the paper that you review this week, I'd love for you to be thinking about, are they meeting all of these requirements for developing a good behavioral coding scheme? All right, so if any questions come up, friends, feel free to come join me during office hours or email me. I'm happy to help. Take care.